Hi and welcome. Now we're looking at abnormal psychology. The personality disorder is the topic. And this week, because we're going to be exploring this, basically there are very pervasive and inflexible patterns of behavior or the way that they interact and relate to other people. Now again, what's a really important thing to emphasize is to make sure that when you're going through the chapters, don't self-evaluate and don't start, diagnosing your friends. That's not our skill set. We're not experienced enough. And of course, we're not trained in this area and using the DSM-5. But it always has a tendency to see some similarities between ourselves and our friends who might say, well, you know what? I see a bit of that in them. But don't make any diagnosis. Now, you may know people who have been diagnosed. And so the difficulty with this and with all the diagnoses that we can make with all the psychological disorders is that we often will overlook the difficulty that there is for the individuals themselves to experience life without the interference of these psychological disorders. And so bear in mind this when we go through all of these, and I'm sorry if I keep repeating myself when we go through these different diagnoses. So what we're going to look at with personality disorder is that the DSM-5 categorizes or clusters personality disorders into A, B, and C. And so we're going to explore each cluster and how they're different. And you'll see some of the overlapping in terms of the pervasive and inflexibility and the patterns of behavior or the patterns in which they relate to people. All right, so let's get on with this one, and I hope you enjoy it. It's going to be a fairly comprehensive one, so try not to get too panicky. And just break them down a bit at a time. I'm just going to do a bit of an overview. You'll find more information in your textbook, okay? Read the small little breakout boxes. They might help a little bit too. Let's go. In spite of the self-defeating consequences, they do not typically see any need to change. Now, the DSM tends to see people with personality disorder as having either egocystonic, which is a natural part of the personality, or dystonic, which is behavior that is seen as foreign or not a part of their own identities. So for our purposes, we're going to go through the three clusters, and I'll just do a quick overview now, and then we'll go through cluster A, B, and C. Cluster A, these are people who are perceived as cold and eccentric. This cluster includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Now, cluster B, this is people whose behavior are overly dramatic, emotional, or erratic. This group consists of antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. And then C, cluster C, which are people who often appear anxious and fearful. Now, this cluster includes avoidance, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And we're going to look at each grouping or cluster and each of these psychological disorders that fit within each. And let's proceed. The first, cluster A, we're going to look at paranoid personality disorder. People with paranoid personality disorder are unduly suspicious and mistrustful of others to the point that their relationships suffer. They do not hold the more flagrant delusions that is typical of people with schizophrenia. Now, it's characterized by beliefs that others are lying, cheating, or exploiting or trying to harm them, a perception of hidden or malicious meaning in benign comments, overthinking comments and analyzing always into a negative conclusion, an inability to work collaboratively with others, and an emotional detachment or an inability to connect with others. They tend to be emotionally numb. Even harmful or hostile to others, and extremely jealous in some cases. Now, it's important to note, and I think I've said this a lot in previous videos, and I'm going to continue to say it, is that in this case, persons with paranoid personality disorder seem cold and hostile, but remember that to them, they're only trying to protect themselves from what they perceive to be a constant threat to themselves. Schizoid personality disorder is normal. It's normal to be reserved about displaying one's feelings at times, or especially when is among strangers. But with schizoid personality, rarely expresses emotion and are often distant and aloof. Yet the emotions of people with schizoid personality are not as shallow or blunted as they are normally seen with people with schizophrenia. Schizoid personality disorder describes people as having little, if any, interest in social relationships. They show a restricted range of emotional expression and appear distant and aloof. It can be characterized by extreme introversion or withdrawal. They're not very social, emotionally distant even from close family members. They're also not interested in pursuing intimate relationships. They can be fixated on their own thoughts and feelings and emotionally detached and emotionally somewhat numb. They prefer solitary activities, and they often include fantasy-type activities such as video games. Now, if we move to the schizotypal personality disorder, this personality appears odd or eccentric in their thoughts and mannerisms and behaviors, but not to the degree, again, found in schizophrenia. It's characterized by indifference or withdrawal from others. There's a thing that's known as the ideas of reference. It's a form of delusional thinking where they read personal meaning into other people's behaviors or external events. These are not accurate, and they are independent of what other people are thinking or doing. It's often sort of a magical or psychic thinking, and I've got that in brackets and my fingers are going quotes. The notion that you can influence behavior and thoughts of others with your own thinking. Tend to be odd and elaborate style of dressing, even eccentric. Speech is often in metaphors or overly elaborate and stereotypical, often revolves around a specific topic. Belief that messages are hidden in public signs, radio, TV, and advertisement. Also, there's an element of suspicion or paranoid ideas and often inappropriate affect. And there's a lack of close relationships, except for immediate family. So this is becoming, I think, there's a similarity you'll find between some of these. And I've shown here paranoid, schizotypal, and schizoid to sort of see that there's a relationship between them. Okay, now we're moving into cluster B. And this is personality disorders characterized by dramatic and emotional or erratic behavior. We're going to start with antisocial personality disorder, and then we'll follow that up with psychopathy. Antisocial personality disorders describes people who persistently engage in behaviors that violate social norms and the rights of others, who tend to show no remorse for their misdeeds. Often characterized by actions most of us would find unacceptable: stealing from friends or family, pathological lying almost continually, and manipulating others with no concerns for their victims, no feelings of remorse. Along those same lines is psychopathy. Now, with psychopathy, the type of personality is characterized by affective and interpersonal traits, such as shallow emotions, selfishness, arrogance, superficial charm, deceitfulness, manipulativeness, irresponsibility, sensation-seeking, and a lack of empathy or anxiety or remorse, and combined with persistent violations of social norms, a social deviant and nomadic lifestyle, and impulsivity. Now, I'm showing you three people here. Two of them are serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. And they were feeling many of the psychopathic tendencies. Now, Bernie Madoff on the right, he's the guy that was involved in a Ponzi scheme that he made millions of dollars off of friends and family, where he was manipulative and deceitful and charming to some degree with people that he knew and who trusted him and took advantage of that. Now, it's important to note, not all criminals show signs of psychopathy, and only a minority of people with psychopathic personalities become criminals. Many psychopaths are law-abiding and quite successful in their chosen occupations. Yet they possess a personality style characterized by callous disregard of interest and feelings of others. Now, there are some psychological and biological factors associated with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. Now, one is the lack of emotional responsiveness. This lack of anxiety when in a stressful situation. Now, if you were tested on a galvanized skin response, this is what measures your respiration, your heart rate, and your sweating. They don't respond very well in that they don't get anxious and they don't find themselves emotionally stressed. Now, there's a model for the craving for stimulation model. It's also known as the optimum level of arousal, where they need a higher than normal arousal just to maintain optimal. Now, most of us don't need to be jumping off of buildings or climbing steep precipices in order to just get to a normal level of operation. But for these individuals, that's oftentimes the case. It's not always bad. Astronauts going into space and is a thrill, I guess, a thrill seeking, but they manage these high stressful situations much better than most of us would. They have a lack of restraint on impulsivity, so they have lower levels of activity in the frontal lobes, and that inhibit this impulsive behavior. Now, the limbic abnormalities that occur, psychopaths that engage in criminal activity may have lower activity in the emotion processing areas of the brain. Now, I've posted in week 6 a video by Dr. Dutton. He studies psychopathy, and it's rather interesting. I hope you enjoy it. Now we're going to look at borderline personality, still under the cluster B. And this disorder is defined in terms of instability in self-image, in relationships and moods. People with borderline disorder tend to be uncertain about their values and their goals, loyalties, career, and choices of friends, and perhaps even sexual orientation. They tend to engage in impulsive acts that are frequently self-destructive. It's characterized by difficult controlling emotions or impulses, frequent dramatic changes in mood, a history of stormy relationships and often involving frequent and intense anger and possible physical fights, a fear of being alone despite a tendency to push people away, feelings of emptiness, and feeling very unstable in relationships and moods. Now, keeping with the B cluster, we'll look at a histrionic personality disorder, and people with the histrionic personality disorder are characterized by excessive need to be the center of attention and to receive reassurance, praise, and approval from others. Such persons appear to be overly dramatic and emotional in their behavior. It's characterized by a tendency to be overly dramatic, seems to be, acting almost. The term histrionic refers to a person who is theatrical in manner, excessive sensitivity to approval of others, attention-grabbing, and often sexually provocative clothing and behavior. Attention-seeking is not always good attention, but bad attention is better than none. There needs to be, they need to be the feeling of the center of attention, and they have excessive concern for physical appearance, a false sense of intimacy with others where they believe everyone loves them, when at times people find them very irritating. Constant and sudden emotional shifts. They're very social, very extroverted, and very self-absorbed. Along the same line in cluster B is what's known as narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder have inflated or grandiose sense of themselves, and, like those with histrionic personalities, demand to be the center of attention. It's characterized by an inflated sense of and a preoccupation with their own self-importance, their own achievements, and their own talents. Constant attention-grabbing and admiration-seeking behavior. Unlike histrionic personality disorders, a person with narcissistic personality disorder looks only for the positive attention. Excessive anger or shame in response to criticism. Manipulation of others to further their own desires, and a belief that they are special or unique. They're preoccupied with fantasies of power, brilliance, recognition, and are often envious of others and believe that others are envious of them. In cluster C, we're looking at personality disorders characterized by anxious or fearful behavior, and we're going to start with the avoidant personality disorder. Avoidant personality disorder describes people who are so terrified of rejection and criticism that they are generally unwilling to enter relationships without unusually strong reassurances of acceptance. It's characterized by hypersensitivity to criticism or rejection, self-imposed social isolation, extreme shyness in social situations, though strongly desire those close relationships, and they long to be accepted but will do anything to avoid being criticized. Dependent personality disorder. Here, people are dependent are dependent or overly dependent on others, and have an extremely difficult time acting independently or even making the smallest decisions on their own. Now, there was a movie that came out a number of years ago called What About Bob? And it's a good example of some of the major characteristics around being dependent on and having a dependee. It's a movie about Bob, who was very dependent on his therapist. Excessive dependence on others, usually a specific person, to meet your physical and emotional needs. Tolerance of poor or even abusive treatment in order to stay in a relationship, and unwillingness to independently voice options, make decisions, or initiate activities. Now, this one might confuse you a bit, but I'm going to make sure we are clear. This is not obsessive compulsive anxiety disorder. People with obsessive compulsive personality disorder have various traits such as orderliness, perfection, rigidity, and over-attention to detail, but without the true obsessions and compulsions that are associated with obsessive compulsive anxiety disorder. And a lot of times it's characterized by excessive concern for order, rules, schedules, and lists, perfectionism, often so pronounced that they can't complete tasks because the standards are so impossibly high to meet. They have an inability to throw out even broken, worthless objects, and an inability to share responsibilities with others. They are inflexible with ideas and moods, that there is in fact a right way and a right way to do it, period. There's financial stinginess, a compulsiveness and devotion to work at the expense of recreation and relationships, and a discomfort with emotions other than the aspects of close personal relationships, since they cannot be controlled or structured. So there are various controversies when it comes to looking at classifications, controversies and problems around personality disorder classification. And there's a lack of a few things, most notably demonstrated reliability and validity. Now, you can remember from week 2 we looked at research and what is reliability and what is validity. In the area of personality disorder, there's some question around the validity and reliability of diagnoses. Also, there's too much overlap between the categories, and you probably noticed that when we went through the clusters A, B, and C, there seemed to be some that were very similar to others. You may find it difficult to try to separate them, and that's also what others find, and this is one of the areas of concerns or problems with personality disorders. And there's a difficulty in distinguishing between the variations of what is normal behavior and what is abnormal behavior. It's part of the reason why at the beginning of this video I sort of said, be careful in not diagnosing yourself or others, is because you're going to recognize elements that you could say, geez, I do that, or I know someone who's like that, but not to the extent that it would count as a psychological disorder. And so this sort of gray area is a bit of a problem. And then lastly is this underlying sexist bias that certain categories and a confusion around the labels with explanations. And so generally, this has been a tough area, not just in the DSM-5, but historically, in making distinctions between what is and what isn't a personality disorder, but also in terms of the clusters within. All right. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Carry on the good work and keep up the work. Don't forget, mark your calendars, check your calendars regularly, make sure you have your syllabus marked up in terms of what's coming up. That's an important element. All right, everybody, good luck.